Welcome to Explore, Explain. This is a long-form video and podcast series sharing conversations with data visualization designers and developers from around the world. Each episode explores the detailed hidden thinking behind a single project or a series of related works to explain the what, the why, and the how of the design process. There are some wonderful guests and some wonderful projects to learn about. So let's jump in to today's episode with your host, Andy Kirk.
Hello and welcome to Explore, Explain and the Season 4 episode finale. We've got some brilliant guests talking about a brilliant project today for the finale. So let me welcome Chloe Whiteaker and Marie Patino. Chloe, Marie, great to see you. Thank you so much for your time today. For the benefit of our viewers and listeners, please can you introduce yourselves, starting perhaps with Marie?
Yes. Hi, I'm Marie Patino, and I'm a graphics reporter at Bloomberg News.
Hi, I'm Chloe Whiteaker. I've been making data viz at Bloomberg for 12 years, and I'm now an editor and manager in New York.
Fantastic. Well, welcome to you both to this episode. And in today's dissection, we're looking at a work that you published last month in October of this year. And this was a project that went big for Bloomberg. This was a project about Taylor Swift. And why would it not go big given the subject matter? And this is about specifically looking at Taylor's vast wealth that she's managed to attain and achieve. So again, for the benefit of the listeners, especially for this, and maybe I'll come to you to kick off, Chloe. Can you just sort of briefly describe this project, just sort of paint a picture of what this is about and kind of what form it takes, and then we'll get into the detailed questions.
Sure. This came about as a collaboration with the wealth team at Bloomberg. Bloomberg's very tuned into billionaires, and Taylor Swift has become a billionaire. Bloomberg, this story was like the first to report that with a detailed valuation that she's reached that status, riding the success of the Eras Tour, which is like taking the world by storm, and her new movie and her album. So we just wanted to kind of break down all the different assets and income streams that play into that valuation, and we wanted to do it in a really fun way, using friendship bracelets, which is a motif throughout the Eras Tour, a major theme, and so we wanted to kind of play on that and use beads as data throughout.
Perfect. A great choice of texture as well for that sort of subject. And just sticking with Chloe for the origin story of this. And you mentioned there that this was essentially a piece of analysis that came from colleagues in Bloomberg Wealth, and we'll name check those colleagues shortly. But it felt to me like the origin of this project was perhaps a bit more akin to the old school approach, in which the graphics people would be approached by colleagues and say, can you do something with this? Can you make this graphically elegant, exciting and fun, rather than something where you were necessarily involved in the data digging and the analysis and looking at opportunities. So can you just sort of elaborate a little bit further on kind of how this opportunity arose in terms of how it landed on your desk, shall we say?
Sure, totally. I mean, you're completely right. This is like definitely one way that stories reach us, is that teams come to us with great ideas. That's not how the majority of our work goes, and definitely not exclusive. So oftentimes we're reporting our own stories. But for this one, the wealth team had been doing a detailed valuation for months, working in the data, interviewing sources about what was reasonable assumptions to make and how to get estimates, and all of the things that go into the inner workings of like the Bloomberg billionaires valuations. I guess what was a little bit different and unique about this one was it was kind of like a unicorn for us. Like even before the story came to us, I had already been noticing a lot of friends on social media posting about making friendship bracelets and just like seeing them around more, and it felt very nostalgic, and I was like, oh man, this is so interesting. It's like total zeitgeist, and I was just thinking, it would be so fun to figure out a way or a story where it would make sense to like use beads and bracelets as data. So I kind of had the idea for the visualization before we knew what the story was.
Interesting.
I started kind of like planting the seed with people on the team, like, oh, I really want to do something with bracelets. And I just like sounded kind of like a crazy person. And then I was like, I think, and it wasn't until a while later, like I like Taylor Swift, but I'm not like a diehard Swiftie. So I didn't know immediately that it was kind of stemming from the Eras Tour. So eventually I like connected the dots and I was like, oh, the story that would make sense for this is like something about Taylor Swift, something about the Eras Tour. I'm not sure what it is, and then I kind of got pulled on to other things until I received the pitch from the Wealth team saying, hey, we're going to release this story next month.
Yeah.
Do you think you could help us out? I was like, yes, please.
Absolutely.
Finally.
Yeah. And that sort of, I don't know, that moment of perfect alignment with all these things I've been thinking about. And yeah, I mean, obviously and it's a term I've only recently learned about, this notion of a news peg. The idea that, Taylor Swift is very much of the moment in terms of the coverage, the profile, the tour, the movies. And so when this also arrives as a very sort of Bloomberg type piece looking at the wealth, it's obviously a great opportunity. Just coming over to yourself, Marie, on this, we, on that note of it being a very Bloomberg piece, it is in the topic of wealth, I guess, but the idea of the visual treatment, which we'll come on to in due course, is quite a departure from the classic Bloomberg ticker, dashboard, whatever it may be. When you think about these pieces and your audience and the typical audience for a Bloomberg visual piece, is this kind of solution that you've worked on, is it a risk? Is it something that you feel as a team you are collectively, I don't know, I wouldn't say moving towards, but you certainly have the license to be more creative than just doing the statistical type analysis? How would you sort of think through the kind of typical audience member who are looking at this sort of piece?
Yeah, I mean, I do think, as Chloe said, that, it was kind of an exceptional case, as in like Chloe really came in with a very specific like design idea in mind and a very specific vision for the piece. And I think that doesn't always happen. So that was definitely great. And members of the team and editors were all very into it. I think after maybe took a little bit to find the right topic, but I think they really gave us the chance and like the opportunity to experiment and, go along with that idea, which took a lot of time, honestly, and like took a lot of, like extra resources, because we had a photographer who helped us with photography, and they really gave us the opportunity to try that out, which was really great. But in terms of the piece, not really, like the piece actually is a very Bloomberg graphic, I would argue. It's very like, it has, the fonts, it has the colors,
Right.
it has really like everything that a Bloomberg graphic normally does have. And I think our team tries to do things that are usually a little bit bolder and more creative in the field, and I do think that specific piece also showcases that. So yeah, like I would argue it's actually a very Bloomberg-y graphic. But in terms of the audience, I think it got like it, yeah, as you said, it was received pretty well. And like on the terminal, I think we looked up stats, but it was a very popular piece the day it was published. So I do think like Bloomberg readers actually, enjoyed it. I wouldn't say they were Swifties, but they definitely, are
That was my
into
next
the
question.
topic.
Yeah.
And yeah, do you want to go ahead, Chloe? Sorry.
Oh, I was just gonna add that, I think that I wouldn't say, there's always that little seed of doubt, like, are people going to get this, or is this going to feel too juvenile for like somebody, a trader who's on Bloomberg's terminal? Of course, you're like, oh, but we don't really let that dictate our design decisions. We just kind of make sure that we meet the readers where they are and bring them along so that they kind of understand it and it makes sense. So that definitely came into the design as well, just like making it very clear that beads are data and that beads are related to Taylor Swift. Because we thought, of course, not every Bloomberg, maybe the majority of Bloomberg's typical audience would not off the bat know the connection. But actually, we were kind of surprised that a lot of people did. A lot of financial people have kids and,
Yeah, of
and
course, yeah.
spouses and partners who are big Swifties, and they are paying for concerts and flying to, booking their
Right.
trips to Paris and everything to go to the concert. We had people in the newsroom who were like, oh, I was just making bracelets with my daughter last night, or they're helping their mom with a side business, like making bracelets. So yeah,
Absolutely.
it was actually surprising.
And I think, to Marie's point as well, the work that your team produces it's always been fun and vibrant and very, very visually impactful, in contrast to the classic cliched mindset, what you would think would be Bloomberg terminals, as you mentioned there, Chloe. And I guess with that, then there's both this kind of creative liberation, this creative license that you've got, but as you'll both know, and we all know, sometimes ideas that we have initially don't always play out. So again, not to get too far down the line with the design choices, but was there a moment when you were thinking, right, this is definitely bracelet time, friendship bracelet time, beads time? Was there a point at which you thought, right, yes, the idea I've had, actually, it kind of works, it's something that we can run with? Or was there a moment when you think, yeah, it's a bit of a 50-50 call?
I don't know. I mean, we just we didn't have that much time to deliberate, honestly. Like
Right.
we received the pitch and we knew that we wanted to get it out within like 2 weeks was our goal. So we had the vision and we just kind of were like, okay, let's just make it work. And like I said, like there were definitely moments where I was like, oh my God, is this gonna just look like a cheap craft project? And I was definitely like had a lot of self-doubt. But as it was coming together, I was like, no, I think it's gonna work. And having Marie there to like bead with and like have two brains working out how it works, like we were just like, okay, we're gonna do this, we can pull it off.
Absolutely. And
Yeah.
I mean, you mentioned there the timescales, and I think that's probably something that it sounds like it helped you on this occasion, that you had that sense of a finish line not too far away, that you just had to say, right, let's just get on with it, and rather than experimenting forever, let's kind of cut through. I mean, some of the other contextual factors, you've already mentioned that the work for the analysis of Taylor Swift's wealth came from the wealth team, and we've got Devon Pendleton, Claire Ballantyne, and Diana Lee, who were involved in the kind of analysis of that. When they came to you, did they already have any ideas or have any, I don't know, kind of almost like requests of what they wanted you to do with this? Or was it something like this is, right, here's some rich material, let us hand over this package to you, run with it, and we'll see what comes out? I'll come to you on this, Marie.
Yeah, I think the original pitch that got on Chloe's desk was pretty general. Like they definitely were doing some kind of valuation, but I think the first data points that we got to see were a little bit more general and were more about the recording industry generally, and her tour and economic impact on cities, which were kind of sporadic stats, not very all coming from the same place. So I do think that the first data points that we got were a little bit less enticing than the valuation that we got further down the line. So the things we got working with at the beginning were, for example, like those city stats, and we have a map on the project showing the different like places where she toured and then the impact on the economy. So that's the first thing that we got started with originally, not really the bracelets and the valuation. But yeah, so it did come onto our desk as a pretty, I think, fully fledged idea of what they wanted to show, and also with a very specific news peg, because there was the Eras Tour movie being released very shortly, and then there was also the re-recording of the 1989 album that was also going to be released shortly. And I think we were all aware that this was a pretty big news moment, as in I think we were all aware that the competition was working on something potentially similar. So there was also definitely that pressure of trying to get something out as fast as possible to not be scooped by the competition. And Forbes actually released a similar evaluation type of article, I think the day after we published. So do think it came pretty close. Yeah.
That's interesting, because I guess there's always this sense that there are, if not hugely influential factors, but there are these external pressures of what are they going to do about this? What are they going to do with this? Not just in terms of when, in the sense of a scoop, but also how. What. And this is something I'm sure that you're always facing with things like election cycles. How do you differentiate your work from others? So that sense that there's a bit of a horse race going on with getting this out. But I've not seen the Forbes piece. I will check it out, and I'll put the image in the video, and we'll contrast the techniques. I doubt they did friendship bracelets, but we'll see. Going again back to the context and the other people involved, and we'll bring up the list of people to properly name check everyone, but especially the kind of photography colleagues that you work with. And we'll talk about the sort of stop motion stuff and the photography later on. But I'm just thinking about this whole notion of like a 2-week cycle. Do you have to kind of in advance book a photographer and say, right, I need them by next Thursday, so we have to get our work ready for photography in by next Thursday? I mean, is that already the sort of almost like project management that you're going through in your mind? I'll come to you on this, Chloe.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, oftentimes when we have a project and we know the hard deadline, we're working in reverse. So we know that we need to leave time for going through the edit process and making any changes. And then back beyond that, we're like, okay, so then how much time are we going to need to get the final, a final-ish draft to edit? And so then when do we need the photos by? So we're just like kind of working backwards to figure out how much time we have to do things. In this case, initially, Marie and I were thinking like, maybe we can just shoot this ourselves.
Right.
And so we got the bracelets because it was so fluid and it was moving fast. I was like, I don't know when we're going to get this done and how we can like just schedule a photographer and coordinate on this timeline. But yes, we took some like very bad iPhone photos just for like rough sketches to show the team, kind of like a dry run of like, here's sort of what we're thinking. And the photos were awful. I mean, we weren't trying very hard to make them good, like, but it was pretty clear. Our editor, Alex Tribute, was like, you really should think about getting a photographer. I was like, yeah, that's actually a great idea. And the photo team had asked us before too, like, do you want a photographer for this? And we're like, I don't know if we'll be able to like make it work with the time. But so that was Marie Monteleone who we worked with, and she was fabulous. And like, it was kind of last minute where we were like, you know what, actually, we need to take you up on that. Do you think it's too late to find a photographer? And she was like, no, I'll get on it. And we told her, we're thinking maybe there could be a stop motion too. So if they have experience making those, and she's like, yeah, that's great. And so she kind of went through her Rolodex and figured out who was available, and he was in like the next day or 2 days later. So it all worked out very well.
Right. And you mentioned that, editors, there's a lot of writing that goes into this piece, a lot of rounds of checks and, other people involved essentially approving that this work is finished and then going live. So, it's a big cast of people involved in these things, and certainly in this case. Just on the, I often ask questions about the technologies involved, and I guess the most important technology to focus on for this is the analog craft stuff. So, Marie, I'm just thinking, how did you go about, I don't know, sourcing the craft materials that you needed for this? I'm, thinking there's glue, there's the beads. Where did you get them from in New York? You run around to the garment district to get these things. What's the sort of the craft side of the tools?
Yeah, we actually got an enormous amount of beads, I will say, from Amazon. We ordered a bunch of, I think 3 different kinds of beads, because originally we wanted to use a different kind, like beads that are called clay beads and that are a little thinner, so that we could have, maybe instead of 20 million per bead, we could have 1 million per bead.
More granularity,
but we tried a couple of things, and honestly, using clay beads looked pretty awful, so we pivoted pretty rapidly to using the thicker pony beads that we end up using in the final piece. So yeah, we got a remarkable amount of beads shipped to the office or Chloe's apartment. I don't remember exactly. And then we brought glue guns in also. And
the glue guns came later, because first we were just like trying to tie knots, and we were like,
of course,
it's really hard to get a good knot with the kind of We didn't have the right kind of string, I think, for like the ideal knots, but
I think there's a picture of Chloe looking desperate as the string untied
Yes.
and everything just went back up.
Yeah, there is a head in hands shot of you, Chloe, which feels like the moment of desperation kicking in.
one of many moments.
Yeah,
But I mean, I think
definitely.
it's interesting there what you've talked about, Maria, that even at this level of something that on the surface is quite a novelty thing, there's a thought that goes into the material type and the different ways that these things might even, I don't know, respond to the glare of a photograph being taken and the size and all these things that you're having to anticipate. So it makes sense that you've got a huge shipment of beads to cover all eventualities without question. Just to cover off another couple of kind of contextual things before I move on to just a little bit about the data. So obviously the original piece was published as a video article by the Wealth team. Was it always the case that you were going to work towards a digital article for this, or were you considering, I don't know, doing some kind of explainer vid for TikTok or for any other platform, or were you always just right? This is the output for this will be an article. Come to you on this, Chloe.
Actually, the article came first, and the video was a collaboration with the Bloomberg Originals
I see.
team.
Right. Okay.
So, but we knew that, I think that the story was probably pitched to them similarly to how it was pitched to us.
Right.
And so we were coordinating our publication timelines for when the video could be ready and when the story could be ready. So we were working in concert so that we would go out at the same time.
Right. Understood. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So we already know about the ideas that kind of triggered this process. I'm also just thinking, were there any other ideas that you had sort of straight off the bat that you didn't pursue? I'm thinking, we're talking about Taylor Swift, talking about music. Was there any temptation to do anything sound-based or, that extra text show? Or was it always just the bracelets is the thing and let's park off any other temptation?
I think we didn't really envision sound at all in the piece. We definitely had in mind other graphic opportunities and other graphic moments, for example, like using cover arts, things like that we didn't end up doing because it wasn't really fitting with the overall design of the piece. But in terms of using sound, I don't think that's a thing we even remotely considered, also potentially because of just time, and that would have been a lot of additional web dev type time that we would have needed. So
and licensing issues probably as well. It probably unlocks a whole world of pain if you go down that route, I guess. But moving on to the data, and I know the data wasn't necessarily the side that you were concentrating on in terms of the whole analysis and sourcing, but I'm just wondering if I can just put a few general ideas of the kind of observations that you might have had about the data you were working with, because I think one of the things that struck me was the kind of point in time of the data and the fact that even a week later the data's going to evolve, not least the fact that she's still on the tour, halfway through the tour. So there's more money to be made in just the 2 weeks that you did the project. But also just, any comments about the struggle that you might have had with any of the data, the dimensions, the range of values, the amounts, because we're talking big numbers here. So any charting approach that you would pursue would always have some intricacies to handle. But any things that stand out from your recollections of the project? I'll come to you first, Marie.
I think definitely the issue, well, not the issue, but the main thing about that data is that it's a lot of estimates. So that's the thing we had to be mindful of. And we worked very closely with Devon, who is one of the main people who did the data crunching, really, to know exactly what was okay to visualize and whether the way we were visualizing it was also okay. Because we didn't want to mislead or misrepresent any of the numbers that we had. There was definitely a thing about ranges as well, as you actually brought up, because some of these numbers also end up being ranges. So I think we had to decide pretty early on whether we were only going to represent, the lower bound or the overall range. And in the last graphic of our piece, of her total valuation, we actually ended up having like a beaded bracelet that represents the upper bound of her valuation. But I think it was definitely a lot of back and forth between us and Devon to know exactly what was okay to be saying, and also wanting to understand exactly what we were looking at, because it came to us in a huge spreadsheet with tons of different tabs and tons of different, like categories. And we wanted to make sure that I think we understood mostly what she had and what she wanted to say.
Yeah. Anything to add, Chloe?
Yeah, I just would add that, like, while most of the stuff is estimates, it is based on a lot of reporting. Obviously, some of the stuff is like very private. There's things going on, of course, like you said, that it's changing all the time. So like the movie came out, and the album and the tour are ongoing. Basically, it is a snapshot, and the way that like Bloomberg's valuations work is it's always based on like past assets. We don't kind of get into projecting future profits. So it just had to be what it was. But and I think we hint in the story that, obviously there's a lot more money to come from this. I think she still had like, dozens more shows to do. But yeah, so we didn't get into like trying to estimate what those would be, or because also with the tour, like she kept adding tour dates and things like that. So that was something that also came up, as like, how many shows did she actually play? Because different sites say different things. Like Ticketmaster says one thing, and her Twitter, like, announced, her website says something else. So just trying to figure out like what actually happened along the tour was one part. And yeah, just like the showing how things are rounded was just like a little bit tricky when you're dealing with beads.
It's hard to put kind of error bars and uncertainty elements into that. But also I think, again, we'll come to it very shortly, but the method of the representation you've chosen doesn't kind of imply, precision. It is methods that kind of give you a sense of big, small, medium, and I therefore think you've got that nice kind of creative license to not get too caught up in worrying about the exactitude of every single data point in this case. Before we get into the design choices, just one last thing about the kind of data or the opportunities that you had with the data. You mentioned there, Marie, that there's this big spreadsheet of all these tabs. I mean, were there any other analyses that you attempted to kind of include but ultimately didn't pursue any further?
Yeah, I think there were a couple. We definitely discussed doing something about, for example, her top valued songs, I think, was a avenue we explored at some point. Also, just the revenue per album was another thing that we discussed. And I think there was definitely a whole thing about knowing how much details we wanted to showcase on every single one of the charts. Because, for example, the overall valuation data viz that we have, could have been much more granular. We didn't really need to stop at, concerts, like tours. We could have divided per, basically there were a lot of other opportunities to do something a lot more detailed and a lot more granular. But I think eventually it wasn't really worthwhile to do that. And I think it was anyway, we tried a bunch of different things, and I don't think any of the things that we experimented with really stick with otherwise. Is there anything else, Chloe, that I forgot in terms of?
There was a fun idea that you had, looking at like the tour, like the stops along the tour. Marie had a cool idea to kind of look at like the evolution of the stadiums that she played, or like the venues that she played at, because you can see in the tours chart that like Eras is enormous, and like her first tour is the smallest in terms of revenue, and it keeps getting bigger and bigger each year, or each round. And part of that is because she's playing bigger venues and selling more tickets, and doing more shows. And so Marie was like, oh, what if we like kind of showed the evolution of like this small little venue in Nashville, and then she has this giant stadium, or like even bringing in like satellite imagery to show like lines forming and crowds, or the parking lots being the most busy than they've ever been. So there were definitely like a lot of rich ideas, and we just kind of had to like pare down and focus on what we could do in the amount of time and what
Yeah.
we could show with beads, and like maintain the consistency through the design.
Yeah, I mean that's something what stood out there. Yeah, those look like really interesting things to pursue, but to pull those off with the bracelet approach would probably be quite hard, and then you don't want to interrupt that flow of the charts that you have got there. Just last question about that then is there also then a something in your mind about we can't make this too long, this analysis, this article? There's an attention span of readership that if we have 30 different sections, it's going to be too long? Or is it just a case of you just get that, through experience, you just get that feel for what is a suitably sized and packaged up piece?
We kind of had a sense of what the main points were that we knew that we kind of needed to make. So we knew that we wanted to show the overall valuation, like what the main parts of that were, and we knew we wanted to show how much she was making from her tours, and the catalog values were kind of like, and then the map of like where she went. So we kind of knew like these are the things that we think we absolutely need,
right?
And then the other things would be kind of like additional. We also generally work really closely with the reporters and what their draft is looking like, to make sure that we're in alignment in terms of, you know, what we're focusing on and where the graphics are going to be placed on the page. So I don't think we were too concerned about it being too long, just because the story, I know you mentioned it was long, but I guess we've worked on much longer stories. So to us, it didn't feel that long. It just was a matter of like kind of reining ourselves in and focusing on just a few key things.
Well, that's it. And I guess, you know, when it's not in print, and therefore you're not limited to physical space, it's more the responsibility of you to choose what to include and what not to include. Go ahead, Marie. Do you have another point there?
You know, I was just going to say that generally, I think on the team, whenever we collaborate with other teams that come to us with a specific pitch, we get some kind of draft. So they sent us the draft, and the first thing we did was going through the draft and identifying visual opportunity or graphics opportunities through that draft. And I think that helps in managing also, you know, overall, like we don't want to overload the draft with too many data viz opportunities, but I also think that when a draft is well made, these can be pretty clearly identified. So that was definitely very helpful. I think we knew from the get-go exactly what needed to be illustrated and where we're going to put it.
Yeah.
And that definitely helped.
And so at this point, are you sketching? I know I've seen a few sketches, but is that also kind of one of the starting points that you'll go through?
Yeah, I think Chloe's like excellent at doing little.
For those watching the video, there's a nice little sketch of what we'll come on to very short, which is a sort of stacked waffle chart type thing. So that was sketch number one. Was that the origin idea?
Yeah, and then there's a couple like more just of the different forms of just started kind of like, what does a bracelet look like? and what are the ways that you can show a bracelet? So the first step in figuring that out was just Marie and I talking about like what we could possibly do with beads and bracelets, and you know, oh, you could make an actual bracelet and you could go based off the height of the stacks, or you can go based off of the number of the beads, or you can do a top-down view and like go by the, you know, the circumference and the area. So there was just that sort of like just throw everything at the wall and think of all the ways that we can look at this bead, and then just
so you're not thinking necessarily in chart type template mode. You're thinking about what's the possibility of the materials and see what things we can then convey through that.
In this case, yeah. I mean, I wouldn't say that that's like a typical process,
no,
but
of course.
For this, we were like thinking about what we could do with it, and then where would that make sense? Where would that fit? And be the easiest to read and understand. So, but then once we kind of thought about the possibilities, we started sketching chart forms, but like as bracelets. So like I tried to draw these like terrible little stacks just to see like, okay, we've got 10 bracelets here, and they're color coded, and or we have the long strings of beads for the tours, and they're like 2 shades per tour to represent different things. And so,
well, the very first thing that we see isn't so much a chart, but it's worth just kind of starting from, which is this stop motion kind of background image of a friendship bracelet kind of building up. That kind of also acts as the sort of title hero image. And I mean, I've seen a few photographs of this process, and it sounds like it took quite a while. Was this one of the first things you did? And can I also just ask the reason for doing a stop motion video? Because it could have been a still, could have been an image. What kind of made you think, yeah, we need something maybe perhaps quite ceremonial for this top band? I'll come to you, Marie, on this.
Yeah, it's actually, I think, one of the last things that we ended up doing.
Okay.
When we were shooting with the photographer. We shot all the stills first and all the charts. The very first chart that we made was that map of her touring. But the stop motion definitely came in first, because I think it was because I think it was on our list of nice to have, but not really essential.
Yeah.
And it's interesting that you said that the intro could have been a still, because at the beginning it was actually a still. Right. It was the last frame of that animation.
Understood, yeah.
That made it into the lead. Also because I think it was a little bit about time and just web development time, because handling the video was going to be a little bit harder, since the background of the piece is white. And when you shoot a stop motion like this, the background of the video you obtain is not going to be perfectly white. It was, a light gray. So we knew that we're going to need a lot of not a lot, but a little bit of post-processing that none of us had really tackled before, using After Effects to make sure that it was embedded seamlessly on the page. So I think we were a little bit worried about that at first. And if we were just going to use it as is, that it wasn't going to look nice, and that, it wouldn't be very seamless. So I think it's probably one of the last changes that we made on the page before publication is including that video as being the lead image, which was then interesting because we had a lot of additional issues with creating a tiny icon and basically making sure that the image used by Google and indexed by Google was not the first frame of the animation. That looks absolutely awful, but the last frame if we could, because the first frame is just a string kind of hanging in there, so it looked a little bit stupid. But yeah, it was, I think it's also colleagues who had seen the stop motion when it wasn't really included yet. And at first we were, I think, only thinking of using it for social images or social promotion purposes. But then colleagues saw it and were like, this is really cool. You should use it in the lead instead of just having it not used at all in the piece, apart from on social assets. So that's how it ended up being in there.
That's interesting. So you almost, I guess, had this sort of foresight that this could act as a nice, as a nice sort of thing to flash around on social media to draw people's attention. It is so novel, clearly. And so, yeah, I'm glad you sort of persevered and got it in there. But again, those little details about how, the spiders that are out there will find the first frame, which is essentially empty. So you have to find a way to kind of resolve that as well. So just all these extra things you've got to go through to complete a piece. I'm just looking, something? Jump in, Chloe, because I will come to you as well. It looked like it was in Marie's tweet, she said it was way harder than expected.
Yes, it was. So we were beating at our desks, to make these bracelets, and we knew that we wanted to make that Taylor Swift bracelet for her evaluation, to kind of like, for her catalog, the evaluation of her catalog, to kind of stand out amongst the other artists that we were comparing her to. And our teammates saw what we were doing, and they're like, obviously very curious and interested and excited to see it. And another reporter on the team, Rachel Dottle, was like, you should make a stop motion out of this. And we hadn't really considered it, but we loved the idea. We were like, oh, if we have time, that would be really cool. So it wasn't something that was initially on our list, and we didn't know where it would fit on the page, for all the reasons that Marie said. It was also the last thing that we did because we had to deconstruct our bracelet. So at the end, it was just a sad string, because with stop motion, you work in reverse. So you have your final product, and then you're just moving beads one by one, until you have nothing left.
And then the tears drop down as this project comes to a close, no doubt. So just kind of moving down the page, I mean, we've already alluded to some of the visuals that were included. The first section looks simply at this, the kind of quantifying of this wealth that's being calculated, but it also, I guess, acts as a visual introduction to the method of how you're going to portray things in future charts. I mean, again, I'm sure you landed on this solution quite early on, but can you maybe just sort of speak to the iteration of this first version, which is essentially a single string with a bunch of orange and gold beads to mark the 1.1 billion wealth that Taylor's achieved, which is very, very good. And also a little sort of side question, which is there's a couple of little light pearl beads just before the zero baseline, which feels like it sort of they need to be there to kind of anchor this thing in place. But I'll just let you speak to the iteration of this first chart.
I can start and then I'll hand it over
sure.
to you, Marie, to finish. So this first chart actually was not in our initial draft that we showed our team and our editors. We just have a meeting where we share everything to just kind of get feedback on things. And this was not included, and it was actually our editor's suggestion that maybe we should have some sort of explainer high up that kind of really introduces the reader to the concept of beads being data, so that, and then also explaining why we're using beads for a story about Taylor Swift. So that was a really crucial addition, I thought, to make, and he made the point that it would really help to have the regular chart infrastructure of having axes and ticks and just kind of helping people kind of get used to how to read it. So we wanted to use the simplest, biggest number and just say okay, this is all of her wealth, and kind of walk people through that process just to kind of ease into how they're going to read the rest of the charts. And we add the annotation and the photos there with the quote of why we're using beads. What is the quote? So make the friendship bracelets, take the moment and taste it. So we added that just as some little context to help people understand why we're using beads.
Yeah, and I think that in terms of, it actually took us a little bit of time to figure out the breaks that we wanted. So know how much how many dollars we wanted each bead to represent. It took a little bit of work, and I think at first we were trying to make sure that everything was harmonized and have the same breaks for every single chart, but then it became not really feasible in the
scales,
end. Because it's different scales, as you're saying. So it took a bit to figure out what was the right length for that 1 billion. And I think pretty early on, we decided that we would have breaks to try to, enable people to count better what was happening, even though we do state the global number for pretty much all the charts. For every single bar, we do say how much is the total. It's still a nice to have to just have that little break. And also it shows that it's a little bit cleaner whenever we have several bars, because everything aligns. But yeah, and we definitely kind of went wild with those tiny white beads. I think I went on an additional run to Michael's or something to get an enormous pack of white beads, so we could have enough to try to make those little anchoring.
I mean, it sounds like you almost had a bead for every dollar that she's earned. So a one-to-one friendship bracelet would have been quite ambitious, I guess. I mean, a little detail that we see in this first chart that we do in all the others as well is this, and I think it's correct. It's kind of almost illustrated string on top of the graphic, and I don't just sort of talk me through that choice, because obviously it doesn't happen by chance. It's a deliberate choice, but I just felt it was a really nice extra little flourish.
I think flourish is the perfect word to use. I like that. We wanted it to feel just not overly polished. We wanted it to feel kind of organic and as if it's being made. We pair it with the photo right next to it of a woman who's making a bracelet, so it gives a sense of it also that it's unfinished. There's going to be more beads probably added, and we couldn't use the actual string because it's clear, clear and stretchy, so it just wouldn't show well. So we just kind of added that as a as a thin black line. I also just wanted to add that some of these, like the separators, had a and these little flourishes, like the little pearls, had a dual purpose because they helped make it easier to read, but then they also just made it feel more like the style of friendship bracelets that you would see people wearing, rather than just like a long
Single,
string that's not very exciting to look at.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. And again, just going back to the little flourish, I mean, it also brings a bit of depth to it, because it overlaps over the photograph. There's a little bit of a shadow, so it kind of brings it as a texture away from the body, which I think works really well. And another thing that we see in this, which is also repeated elsewhere, is just a little random scattering of the occasional bead, which again adds to this sense of a live craft taking place. I mean, I think, Marie, you might have been responsible for this, as well as some of the other animations that we see lower down. What was the thinking there? Was it just simply a case of, let's just sprinkle them because why not?
Yeah, I mean, I think that in projects like that, in all graphics projects, the details are super important. So I do think we really wanted to make sure that the whole project felt, polished, and that we were really paying attention to details and trying to make it as joyful and fun that we could. So the pearls were pretty, I don't know, it just became pretty clear that it would be a thing that we could be doing also with the material that we had, just because we had already shot the beads and we had them. So it was pretty easy to add them in. And yeah, it's the same thing for the Polaroid pictures. That is a repeated motif throughout the whole entire copy and the whole entire story. I think it's nice to be consistent. So if you give that a picture of the Polaroid treatment, then give all of your pictures that treatment, because it's just going to make it more cohesive and coherent and just make it more fun too. So the scatter of beads was definitely something that was also a pretty low-hanging fruit, just because we had them. And then we wanted to repeat that bead motif throughout the story. So and the animations, I think, were also came pretty late as a nice to have. That was definitely not essential, but hopefully help make the whole story also like punctuated with little moments where that kind of revive readers' attention, or make them be like, oh, that's fun, or things like that.
It's like little
which
gifts
hopefully
as you go down,
does.
little gift to the reader. These are something new
hopefully.
to look at, and that sense of coherence and consistency unifies the whole thing together brilliantly. The next chart down is, I don't know, it's perhaps the one that is the most clipped and the most sort of, I don't know, kind of quintessential for this piece, which is this, I don't know what we're going to call it, stacked bead unit waffle chart thing. I don't know. We'll work that out after the recording. But we've got this breakdown of Taylor's Taylor. I know Taylor very well personally.
It's Taylor's version.
This is the kind of the breakdown of her wealth into different components of the back catalogue, the concerts, streams, etc. I think one of the design choices I was interested in is the color choices. I mean, you might not have taken much time of a kind of agonizing over which colors to use for catalogue versus concerts, but there is obviously a categorical divide there. And also within each of the sections or stacks, we've got different shades of colours in most cases. So just big general question of how did you make the choices around the colours, and also the varied nature of those shades within those stacks?
I think we can start taking that one.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, I guess for starters, we were choosing from a limited palette because it was based off of what beads came to us on Amazon. Sure. Of course, you can get anything on Amazon. Maybe we could have gotten any shade under the sun, but from the packs that we had to kind of work with that and choose colors that had enough contrast and looked nice together. And then we kind of started with the tour chart actually when deciding the colors further down, where there were some times where colors just seemed to be like more associated with certain eras. So like red, obviously we wanted to use red there. And the reputation, I think we kind of associate with green more, with
Right.
like snake, and she wore a green jacket and things like that. So we kind of took inspiration from the cover art and just the themes throughout her different eras to kind of land on the selection of colors that we were working with. And then from there, like moving back up to the what we just internally called the stack, was like, you know, for concerts, we went with pink because Eras makes up the largest portion of that, and we had used pink for Eras lower down, and for catalog, that's like the biggest part of the pie, and we chose purple just because that was kind of the color that we wanted to use the most throughout. There were like, you know, in Marie's,
the color of wealth, I think historically as well, purple. Yeah,
very royal. There you go. And just like the photos that Marie had selected were had like some nice purple undertones, and the treatment that she added for the Polaroid kind of gave a purplish tone, and her map was purple, so we kind of wanted that to be like the biggest color, and then the other ones were just a little bit more what looked better next to each other.
And I suppose kind of reversing backwards, you end up with only a few colors left over that are going to be cohesive and consistent and available. Actually, I think one of the things that I didn't appreciate when I first saw the project, and I've only recently noticed it in preparation, is the responsiveness of the charts for different platforms. And it looks to me, correct me if I'm wrong, that there's almost 3 layout versions of each one. There's a wide shot, a mid one, and a narrow mobile. I mean, that's a lot of extra work. Are they kind of truly responsive, or are they almost like prepared views based on whatever trigger point there is for the width?
Yeah, we're using AI to HTML, which a lot of newsrooms and graphics newsrooms use generally. So we do have breakpoints for whenever you resize the screen. And usually we make about like 3 views, sometimes 4. It depends. So definitely those are all prepared depending on the breakpoint and the screen size that you're on. They're all pre-baked into, you know, the whole web page. But it was definitely interesting because we are using a lot of beads that have letters on, for example, for like the stack. Well, maybe not for this. Well, for the stack also. And at a very small screen size, some of them become pretty unreadable. So especially for one chart, I think our tour chart, we ended up having. So the beads basically exist as the thing that says the name of the tour on desktop version, but then on mobile, they're just normal text, and we just cut out the beads that say something because it just becomes impossible to read because it's too small. So I think it definitely, this specific project and using beads definitely did create very specific challenges that I don't think we particularly foresaw coming, just because of the sheer nature of using beads, especially for text.
Our photographer was also really helpful. Zach Dazan was super helpful for this because when we were shooting, we tried to think of like all the things that we might need in post-production. And of course we didn't think of everything. But we did have him shoot like all of the possible, like all the letters in the alphabet, so that if we needed to kind of like swap them in. But he had the great idea of like, oh, we need to shoot them not just like one shot of all the letters of the alphabet, but we need to shoot it from like multiple angles so that the shadow is different depending on like the orientation of the beads. So like the animated beads and like the little flourishes throughout, like those beads were all shot at multiple angles so that wherever we needed to place them, they made sense and were consistent, which I was like, wow, I definitely wouldn't have thought of that.
Wow, yeah.
But for the middle artboard, like for the tour chart that Marie is talking about, the widest artboard is just the bracelet and the beads all in scale, and then the middle artboard is also like we scaled up the letters, the letter beads, so those are like larger versions, so that they remain readable. And then because we're like encoding crucial labels into images, we had to be very mindful of making very detailed like alt text to explain exactly what the chart shows so that this is accessible to people using screen readers. So there was definitely a lot of like extra work going on behind the scenes there.
Yeah, I mean, that's what's coming across a lot, is that there's obviously in this, again, let's just reduce it to a simplistic 2-week period, but there's obviously a lot of kind of creative preparation, then there's a kind of execution of the ideas, but then there's almost this not necessarily entirely unanticipated finessing and production to finish off things, but a huge amount of extra invisible work that's not always appreciated, especially, and I'm glad you mentioned the alt text and the accessibility, because it's something that, is clearly, has always been important, but is ever more so something that we should do and deliver and make as accessible as possible. So now moving to the next piece, which is the map, the tour journey, and I'm wondering just how many, I don't know, iterations this went through, what different ideas you had, because it could be all sorts of things. And the basic premise of the chart as it is this basically the outline of the contiguous US states, sorry, the US landmass, should I say. And then we've got kind of photos, again, the kind of Polaroid photo, and then this sort of route and journey through this. Marie, did you sort of run with this one primarily? What was the iteration of thinking for this?
I mean, I think that, as we mentioned before, this pitch kind of came to us, and the first data points that we had were the city related data points, so the impact of her tour on specific cities in the US. So it really became the first thing we could actually act on and do while waiting on the additional valuation data points. And I think pretty early on, the reporters knew that they wanted some kind of tour map or representation of her tour. We brainstormed a few different things. I think pretty early on, when we knew we were going to do things with beads, we were just like, oh, that could be fun. So yeah, it like we knew it was going to be a thing pretty early on, but the map itself definitely did go through a few iterations. Originally, it was maybe going to be a scrolly, which then it didn't end up happening because it really wasn't necessary in this specific case. So I was discouraged by editors from pursuing that, but it was going to be a scrolly at first. So basically we scroll through and you see like her tour line animates, and maybe there's a little bus or something that kind of moves around, and then you see where she's gone over the last few months. So that specific portion of how we were actually going to implement the map, I think just became different in the end. But then I think the main point in terms of, we basically call out a few different cities and a few different data points, and then we illustrate some of them with photos. And that really just came from what was available.
Yeah.
Photos of her tour were actually the best. And then what data points for which cities were the best. And that's what we ended up going with. It was definitely a challenge to not make it look too cluttered. And it might look a little too cluttered, I'm not sure. But then, on mobile, so there is also, I think, maybe 4 different versions of this map. The large version on desktop is the one that you see with all the different bead outlines.
Yeah.
The medium version is actually the whole entire US flipped. So like the map itself is just flipped. And then the mobile version just gets rid of the outline of the US entirely, because it just wasn't really manageable to illustrate on mobile, and is just a little bit more, the geography is not fully respected, but it's still there. Like there's still logic to it. And we went through that with, our editor, Alex Tribu, who also kind of helped on the placement of where the cities were going to be on mobile. And I think that was probably one of the charts that just looks pretty different on desktop and mobile, and is maybe the one that looks the most different, depending on both, and which screen size you see it on. But yeah, I think we had a very specific idea of what we wanted it to show from a pretty early point, just because also it's the reporters who had a specific idea of what they would ideally want. So we didn't start from nothing, basically.
Sure. Anything to add, Chloe?
Marie really ran with this, and I think she did an awesome job. I just was having fun watching as she layered more things
Tacky
in.
Glued.
Is that enough of Florida coming out at the bottom there, and Chicago, and some intricate borders to capture.
She printed out, so she started with like a vector version, and then she printed it out on just like an 8 by 8.5 by 11 sheet, and did it all in reverse. So like on the on the opposite side, just kind of see the outline through the paper, coming through the paper to glue it on. And it took, a lot of precision, and the beads kept falling off.
Yeah, it was pretty awful to manipulate and carry to the photo studio. There would be like 10 beads falling out, and I would be like, no, need to redo all of it. But yeah, and then basically it was flipped in Photoshop. We just flipped the outline, and then it became the US again.
And I like the tour feels a bit like the string as well, kind of binding it together, which another little detail there. The fourth chart, you've already been very generous with your time, so we'll just kind of move quickly through some of the rest of the features. The fourth chart is a fairly similar kind of approach to what you use at the start with the kind of the overall wealth. This looks at the different tours and the money that Taylor Swift has made, and starting from the biggest to the current one, which still is 89 tour shows yet to complete, and then down to the I guess Fearless, was that the first one? It feels like mathematically it would make sense. And then just going down to the last one, again, a bit of a departure, perhaps more akin to the map one, in that we've got a bunch of circles sized by the pricing or the sale price of the back catalogues for a selection of other very, very famous artists. A couple of questions about this. First of all, I love the solution for the lower bound and the upper bound for the Taylor Swift kind of fried egg or wheel type chart. How did you end up including these specific artists for comparison? Is it just that they are the most obvious that you would include in that comparison off the top of your head, or were there some that were left out, some included at the last minute? What was the sort of iteration of that?
So as for like which artists we selected, it was there wasn't too much deliberation here. It was basically artists who have sold their album since the pandemic,
right?
Or their catalog since
the
pandemic. So this is pretty much, these are the biggest sales since 2020. It's become more of a thing in recent years for artists to do. I think maybe there was one sale that wasn't included because we didn't have like a hard price for it. We just had a range, and we didn't really want to get into ranges for everybody. We just wanted to keep it straightforward. So, and only including the range for Taylor because she hasn't actually sold. So these are definitely like lower bounds and upper bounds.
Understood. Yeah.
I know that Devin had spoken to a lot of experts to get estimates to base these off of for Taylor's valuation, and it's something that like everybody's paying attention to right now. So plenty of people weighed in on that, and this is what we felt was the most accurate.
Yeah, and again, I think it's another nice continuation of the method that you've used, although now it's much more, I guess, little beads, and then we've got the names of the artists, and yeah, it just gives another variation of the theme to kind of close off the fifth piece of analysis. And there's all sorts of things that we could get into around the copy and the writing that went into this, and some of the choices around the kind of annotations that you included in the charts. But I'll kind of leave this open to yourselves. Any other little details that you want to raise, or things that took loads of time and loads of pain off the page that we don't recognize. And I'll start with my favorite little bit, which is the rolling bead at the end, which acts as this sort of, the French word fan. When you finish the movie, it just felt closure at the end, which I liked. But I'll come to you first, Marie. What's any other little detail that you want to share with people? You won't believe what we went through for this.
Yeah, no, the rolling bead at the end was definitely fun to have and fun to make. Yeah, this is like a little sprite animation. So basically like made maybe 18 different frames of that weird bead kind of rolling into Illustrator and then loop through them with CSS, which was definitely fun to be able to do. I think like we asked Zach to take 4 different shots of the bead in different orientations. So, top down, on the side, on another side, and then kind of, I don't know, 45-degree incline, so it could be kind of falling.
Yeah.
So that was definitely very fun to make. I think a thing that you don't necessarily see on the page is that every graphic and every string of bead, we actually had to, tie them to something in some kind of way. So we hot glued, and especially Chloe hot glued, the little circles at the end with the different catalog valuation,
Right.
to white foam boards. And that took so much time, and there was a lot of different wax material, glue things going on. Our hands were just super sticky. It was kind of horrifying. But that took a lot of time. So the preparation of the actual set and the actual material before it was shot was definitely took so much longer than actually shooting the things themselves. I think is a thing you definitely don't see.
Right.
And then maybe Chloe can talk about post-processing, because that's also a thing you don't see on the page. That took so much time, so much time.
Yeah, well, I just want to second what Andy said, which is that the little animations that Marie added are some of my favorite parts too. They just are, they add some whimsy
The icing on the
and
cake.
joy.
Yes. Yeah.
And just a little bit of surprise and whimsy that I just love. And what she was saying about the catalog valuations, oh my God, it was really hard to make these sit in perfect circles. They're not perfect circles, but as close as we could get to perfect circles, and trying to figure out how many beads go between between the first name and the last name, because every last name is different and every catalog size is different. So it was a bit tricky. And my favorite little bracelet that I made was the miniature Justin Timberlake, and I want to send it to him and Jessica Biel for their baby. I just think it's so tiny and cute. But yeah, the post-processing, wow, that was many hours. Marie and I our eyeballs were bleeding, just staring very closely in Photoshop because even though we shot all of these on a white background, and we had Zach set up great lighting and took great photos, it was still a lot of work to cut out the background so that it would look like it was laying on the screen itself. So that was especially when we ran into issues where we had to reshoot actually because some numbers changed, or we realized that we put the wrong label with the data, so we got it kind of mixed up in a couple places, so we had to go back and redo the bracelet and then reshoot and then redo all the Photoshop. So there was just there was a lot of things. It was a lot harder to correct mistakes when you're working with physical viz, was the lesson that I took.
Well, I mean, I think the sort of summary concluding thought I have about this is that you've put a lot of work into this, and a lot of work that is hidden, and that's in a sense the whole premise of these podcasts, is to expose those things that people don't always appreciate. But just to close off then, reflections, I'll start off with yourself, Marie. I mean, it sounds like it's been a lot of fun, a lot of hard work, but a lot of fun, a lot of enjoyment, a lot of unique aspects to it. And I guess the question I've got is, is there a piece of feedback that you felt was most treasured? I don't know how much you read the comments below the line or on Twitter, but was the one sort of element of feedback that you saw floating around that you thought, yes, I'm glad someone's said that, thought that, felt that?
That's funny, because we did talk about that with Chloe quite a lot, and there was one piece of recurrent feedback that showed up quite a lot on social media, and it was Swifties asking for us to be paid more and saying, Bloomberg, give your graphics designer a raise, because they really nailed it with this visual. And I think there were quite a few actually saying that, which was pretty hilarious.
Campaign, then,
and yeah, it was great. We appreciated it, and I screenshot every single one of them to for my next
review
evaluation. Yeah, absolutely. So that was really fun, and honestly very different from any of the other. It was nice to see the graphics being celebrated also, not just the written piece.
Reflections from yourself, Chloe?
Oh yeah, I mean, I thought that was hilarious and unique for stories that we work on, other stories that we work on. But I think also what was unique was I shared this with my family. It was in front of the paywall for a little while, which was nice. So more people could see it, and I shared it with my family, and my sister was she works in a hospital, and she was showing some of the other nurses, and she's like, your sister made that? I've seen that on my feed 5 times already. And I think that's the only time that's ever happened to me, where people who aren't tied to news but are connected by some degree of separation to me. We're actually
that's cut through.
seeing it. So that was cool.
Absolutely. Yeah, wonderful. Well, listen, you've got a very busy day, so thank you ever so much for going into so much detail for that. It's a wonderful project. I'm so happy to kind of close the season with profiling that. So thank you, Marie. Thank you, Chloe. Thank you, everyone out there, for watching and listening, and see you soon for a new season of Explore, Explain. Bye for now.
To see more information about today's episode, including some links to key sites and resources mentioned, please visit my website at visualizingdata.com. Here you'll also be able to find details about my book, information about my public and private training courses, as well as over a decade of blog posts. If you've enjoyed this series, please consider liking, subscribing and spreading the word. See you next time.